Welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast. In this episode, we will discuss the inaugural lecture entitled No Woman's, No Man's, No... How did you title that? I'm not sure how Joe introduced it.
It's No Woman's Land, Writing History at the Intersections of Gender and First World War Studies was the title.
But it's the brackets on the...
Yeah, for the listener, it was a play on No Man's Land, and I put the WO of woman in brackets. So it works better on a poster than it does perhaps on a podcast.
And this lecture was given by our very own Professor Jessica Meyer earlier this month. I'm Angus Wallace. Joining me are Chris Kempshall and Jessica. Amusingly, having realised I failed to read the abstract beforehand, I was thrilled to see it unfold.
The Oh What a Lovely Podcast guarantee, never knowingly prepared.
Well, I ended up writing the abstract in a little bit of a hurry and then writing the lecture afterwards. And it did work. I'm pretty sure it worked. I was quite pleased with the structure in the end. Inaugurals are funny things. One of the people in the audience afterwards who is a former dean and so has quite a lot of experience of going to these things. So, they're sort of a funny genre to do because your audience is quite diverse. You can either do something entirely retrospective or you can do, sort of what I intend to do with this new role or something slightly different. And I slightly did a mashup of all three. So I think it worked.
It was good. For the listener who wasn't attending, I wondered if our starting point could be, as you did with the lecture, the 2014 article written by Kate Adie for The Guardian. Why did you put a pin in that as your starting point?
So when that article originally came out, I wrote a blog post called On Being a Woman and a War Historian. So when I proposed an inaugural that was reflecting on being a woman writing the history of the First World War, and I was thinking about it in terms of I'm primarily a gender historian for all that I also write about history of medicine, history of disability, histories of welfare. I am first and foremost a historian of gender. And that was where I started thinking about the inaugural. And that took me back to that blog post, essentially, which was fundamentally a response to Adie's article. For those who haven't encountered it, and you can find the post which links through to the article on my blog. But for anybody who hasn't encountered quite an old article, it was published at the beginning of the centenary when Adie, as part of the BBC's centenary commemorations work, was writing a book on women's contribution to the First World War. And she wrote this piece for The Guardian that was publicizing this book, saying, women don't write the history of the First World War, which I think a lot of women at the time sort of went, really? What she did was she said, she acknowledged that there are women who write the history of the First World War, and she name-checked Barbara Tuchman and then said, and there are all these women who write from the feminist perspective who talk about women's experience. Well, first of all, there are many more women who write and have written the sort of military diplomatic history of the war, other than Barbara Tuchman. What really troubled me was the sort of parceling of all the women who've written about women's histories of the war, which it's this huge subfield, and it's developed enormously over the years. But my own PhD supervisor was Deborah Thom, who wrote Nice Girls and Rude Girls, which is a history of women's munitions work in the war, which is exactly what Adie said there hadn't been enough history of. And yes, the initial histories of women's work in the war tended to focus on nursing, on VADs, on middle-class women's involvement. But since the 1980s, there has been a huge amount of work on working-class women's involvement, on women doing all sorts of things, not just munitions work and nursing, which are sort of the traditional things we think about women's contribution to the war, but humanitarian aid, welfare, Tammy Proctor's amazing work on women spies, which goes well beyond Mata Hari, and looks at La Dame Blanche. There's been a lot of international work on women, on the multiple ways in which women experienced war, as well as, histories of the home front. Now, to be fair, a lot of the histories of Women on the Home Front came out in the centenary period. So it's a little bit unfair to criticize AD on that ground at that point. But it was already there, and a lot of the social histories of the war had brought in women and women's voices and women's writing. So my original blog post was slightly disheartened that, the field of First World War studies as an academic field has failed, at least in Britain, to communicate all this really exciting stuff that's going on in gender history. And I think that's still something that we find a challenge. There is a huge literature which somehow, even with the centenary, we haven't managed to communicate all the really interesting and diverse approaches, and people still tend to think of the First World War in quite cliched terms. And one thing I did mention a bit later in the lecture was that, when I say I work on gender, medicine, and the First World War, people say, "Oh, you research nurses." Well, yes, but not the nurses you're thinking of. And they're certainly not the only people I'm interested in looking at, which is not, there's some fabulous work being done on nurses. And because there's a huge range of nursing experience that goes well beyond Vera Brittain. But the go-to point tends to be, I think, in the public mind, Vera Brittain. So yeah, the inaugural itself, I tended to be quite positive about, the richness of the field as it existed in 2014 and how it's developed since then. I talked about what's happened in the last decade. But I do think there is some pessimism there that somehow we're not cutting through still. Other than things like this podcast, I don't quite know what to do.
Well, what amused me was that when I was teaching the module on the First World War, the Kate Adie book, which name right now escapes me, was regularly trotted out as being the book on women in the First World War, which you have to, can we look a bit further? Can we stretch ourselves to look beyond this? This is really a work of popular history. We need, can we look a bit further? Have another go back and have a look. But it was always seemed to be produced as, this is the book. No, it's not the book.
It's also interesting what you're saying, Jessica, about this kind of this struggle to break through, because there's an element of you're fighting against like pre-existing stereotype of it's women munitionettes, it's nursing and the like, and women historians apparently don't write anything else. Without kind of going down like a list of people who are, for example, in the International Society for First World War Studies, there are things. Margaret Macmillan has written the definitive book, not simply like a contribution to a field. It's like it's the book on diplomacy at the end of the First World War, which you can find in Waterstones.
Part of it is, and this is working with something like the BBC, where one of the things that we did at Leeds as part of the Legacies of War project was we did a MOOC, a massive open online course, which partnered with the BBC. And we had a meeting right at the beginning with some of the BBC representatives who were really keen on using the talent, which included people like Adie, like Jeremy Paxman, people who they saw as having presentational experience to deliver the material. And that was something they wanted to do. And we went, well, first of all, we have quite a lot of presentational experience. We all teach. This is what we do. Now, we don't necessarily teach on screen. This was still something quite new for us pre-pandemic. But, that is part of our skill set, is communicating to an audience. But also, you can't just take our research and put it into other people's mouths. And there is a little bit of a sense of that. And this certainly happened with Paxman's Great Britain's Great War, where I sat and watched it going, you need to cite Adrian Gregory. You need to cite Adrian Gregory.
Adrian Gregory has weirdly turned into Jeremy Paxman on my TV.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Paxman publishes a book, which is essentially The Last Great War under a different title with slightly different with images from the program. And there is a way in which the media, for want of a better term, has a very blinkered view of the ability of academics to communicate it. And it is back to that sense of, this is going to be too academic. This is not going to have a general appeal, which is immensely frustrating. And I do think there's a lot of ways in which we're working against it, but it does mean Margaret Macmillan is on the BBC's list of talent But they have their go-to people, and it's not necessarily the experts in the field. And that's, where I think there's been less cut through in some ways, is being able to demonstrate actually those of us who are working rigorously in the field and providing new research, we can also talk about it publicly and communicate this effectively if you'll give us the opportunity to do so. And that's not universally true. And I don't think that academics have necessarily made the best case. And there are problems around, university workloads trying to fit academic media work alongside teaching, admin, research, all the stuff we're already trying to do where we're already overworked is really problematic. And there's certainly plenty of us who don't approach media work with as open a mind as we could do. But I think, there are problems on both sides, basically.
The media all play it safe because they don't want to necessarily offend people. They don't want to necessarily challenge people. They like to reinforce people's existing beliefs. But you're very busy, Jessica, always with public engagement. And you just made me think there. But I have a feeling that from a public engagement, there is a groundswell of people when you do your presentations who do turn up. I've been to one of your talks at a local history group, and there's 40 or 50 people there. So it's not as if people are not interested.
I will say, I'm not sure they're interested in me necessarily. It's not name recognition. It can be topic recognition. I do work on, I tend to work on topics that people do find interesting. It's also the amazing work of those local history groups. It was Northallerton, wasn't it, that you came up to? They were clearly a really energetic, regularly involved local history group. I've talked a couple of times to a group in Bradford who were amazing. They'd done their work. They didn't just turn up because it's what they did every fourth Wednesday in the month. They were there because they wanted to hear what I had to say. And I can do all the research and all the public engagement and make it as engaging as possible. But, having the really interesting, and I think this is where sort of the national media is slightly missing a trick, is that they do underestimate that audience. They're really open to new research, to challenging ideas. They're not just there to have their ideas reinforced. They want to learn, which is very much like being in a classroom when you're getting up in front of a whole bunch of first-year undergraduates. They're there because they want to learn. Now, they may not know that they want to learn about the cultural history of the First World War, and they may go, but you're going to make us read a detective novel a week. This isn't fair. This is too much reading. And some of them won't get beyond that. But you'll always get a few who are going, oh, wow, that's a new way of looking at history. I'm really interested. That's the joy of teaching. I had a question at the end, which was about how I saw my research feeding into my teaching. But actually, I think, my public engagement feeds my teaching or overlaps with my teaching in a lot of ways.
Often left with the feeling that the BBC in particular, when it thinks of local history groups, thinks of genealogy enthusiasts, and then thinks, well, we're doing, who do you think you are? So that's what we provide to them, and never really kind of consider anything any bigger or deeper than that.
Yeah. And I have to say, I've got plenty of questions of, I know my great-grandfather or grandfather was in hospital. How do I find the hospital records? And I keep on having to say, I'm really sorry that they don't exist. But usually that's accompanied by, oh, that was really interesting. Now I have a better sense of what that experience would have been like, not because I have the specifics of where they were and what it was like, but because knowing that they were in hospital and knowing what a hospital experience might have been like helps me understand better.
Did the centenary work to expand academic scholarship on? I was going to use the term gender because I think you make a really interesting point how gender is not just code for women, and I think it's easy for people to slip into feeling that gender just means women. They're just going to hide it behind women's studies, behind the word gender.
So the interesting thing is that that's a discussion that goes well beyond First World War studies. And I spoke in the inaugural quite a lot about the work of John Tosh and Mike Roper, who wrote this introduction to manful assertions in the 1980s, which really sets out the political case for why we need to do masculinity studies, which is really about if we treat men as an empty category in gender terms, that limits our understanding of men's experiences because men are gendered. by cultures and societies, but also it puts this enormous burden on women as the carriers of gender, which is something that feminists have been pushing back against. Denise Riley's Am I That Name was hugely influential for my thinking on this when I was doing my PhD. Women as carriers of gender is a problem. So if we can start to interrogate men, we can start to move away from that. That has applications well beyond histories of war, well beyond the history of the First World War. John Tosh is a historian of 19th century masculinity. A lot of the people I've worked with, collaborated with over the years in terms of histories of masculinity are 17th, 18th, 19th century historians rather than 20th century historians. And this is why I was thinking in terms of intersections. So I think since I've been working in the field, I do think there has been a shift. What's been interesting is sort of the political takeover of the term gender it's interesting. So when I started as a historian of gender, there was an assumption that you were a historian of sexuality, that if you studied men's history critically, you were doing queer history or the history of gay men. And part of that, I think, was through an association with R.W. Connell's Masculinities, which of course is a sociological study of gay community, at its heart is a sociological study of gay communities in Australia. And I did spend quite a lot of time going, no, I'm thinking about cultural attitudes around things like fatherhood and normative constructions, at least 19th century normative constructions of masculinity, and how these are not monolithic. And I think what has happened is there's been, that understanding of gender has become something about gender nonconformity. It's increasingly incorporating, as it rightly should, trans histories. But it does still tend to push out, where does that interrogation of so-called traditional masculinities, normative masculinities, how do we keep that from being an empty monolithic subject? How do we make sure that we interrogate it critically? And sometimes I think the queering of gender academically has been to the disadvantage of that particular aspect of the project, which is why doing histories of masculinity in war or in politics is really useful, because that wars are points where particular forms of normative masculinity become really socially important for recruitment, for the management of militaries. It's a historical point, to go back to Joan Scott's point about war as points of gender disruption. She was thinking about that in terms of gender disruption for women. Wars are terribly disruptive to women's lives and women's social roles. But the same is true of men. And I think that's what I found quite useful about doing it, particularly in terms of war. That still doesn't answer your question about the expansion, which is to say, yes, I think, there's more diversity. And certainly I've noticed this in the classroom in terms of you introduce these ideas to students and they get really excited by them. And they come to you with really interesting dissertation projects. A lot of them still tend to focus on women, but they're finding different stories about women by taking this approach. And I think that's where it's expanded. I think in terms of the scholarship, the gender as an approach has become part of the, it's not a marginal field anymore. That is the shift. It is part of the social and cultural history approach, like class, like race. And I don't think that academically we question that the way we might have done at the very beginning of my career, that this was seen as an unusual way to think about history.
I mean, thinking back to when you began your career and this kind of conversation about the field, and the field is different from the research in this. And has the field gone in directions that you would have expected it to? How is the field looking now compared to how you thought it might pan out? Because obviously we've had the centenary during that, which can act as a weird warping device. But
it's funny because I've always had a slightly accidental career. I've never meant to be an academic. So Max Jones, who was my PhD supervisor for my first year before he moved to Manchester while I stayed in Cambridge, he asked me right at the beginning, at our first supervision, what my career plans were. And it was partly so he could give me the warning, which I still give to PhD students, which is, oh God, the employment landscape is grim. You don't want to become a professional academic. And I said, I don't know. I'm really interested in the subject. I want to do the PhD, but then I think I'll probably go and do a law conversion course. At which point he said, okay, yes, I'll supervise you on that basis. I did not go and do a law conversion course, in case anyone is wondering. I still might, if things don't pan out. But, because of that, because I've never had a sense of this is my destiny, I've never really thought about it in that time. It was also, I also had the experience of moving from the US to the UK, where for First World War studies, the environment is very different. And I think that's the thing maybe is unexpected, is the extent to which First World War studies has grown in the US. There's some great scholarship in the US. Wonderful stuff being published on the American experience, and still is wonderful stuff being published on the American experiences, but very much looks beyond the military history and the stuff on humanitarian aid and the work of the American Red Cross, Heather Perry's work on Germany, Michelle Noyd's work on Germany, on the African experience, and then, I've already mentioned Tammy Proctor, Sue Grayzell. There is fabulous work coming out of the US. And I think that's the bit that I perhaps didn't expect. And I think the acceptance of social and cultural history as a way of understanding not just the home front or the non-military experience, but applying that to the military experience. So Alex Mayhew's book has just come out, and that feels like something that I wouldn't have expected to be published at the start of my career. But I can also see how the way in which the last couple of decades have, the discussions that have been had during those years have helped to feed into work like that, which is great.
Has the centenary helped? Has it actually been helpful, do you think? Because, for every fantastic, new academic book that's come out, you get a Kate Adie moment that kind of reframes things a bit.
I'll tell you where it has been helpful, and this is the sort of bit that I didn't talk about in the inaugural, was the popular culture side of it. Because, as well as the gender and medicine research, the bit that's always driven me is representations of the First World War in popular culture from 1914 onwards. And I think what the centenary did was, make the First World War an interesting subject for culture again. It goes through these waves. It disappears and then reappears as a cultural subject, as we've reflected on in this podcast, right, in terms of the things we've looked at. And I think the centenary definitely made it part of, certainly in Britain, made it part of the cultural conversation again, which has been fantastic. Every time I mention what I do and that I'm interested in popular culture and the First World War, somebody now mentions In Memoriam. And I promptly say, have you heard our podcast on this?
And have you read the other books it was based on?
Yes, that as well. Or someone mentions 1917, and I think the centenary definitely helped with that. It's no longer just a niche subject. And I think it may also have changed, the ways we approach memorialization and commemoration, looking at D-Day, the way in which D-Day is discussed in the popular press. I think that's been shaped by the way the centenary was commemorated.
D-Day was not a celebration, oddly. I'd put a lot of thought into D-Day and how much of it was celebration or commemoration. I expected a popular approach to it to be celebration. It was actually very much commemoration, which quite surprised me.
And I think that comes from a lot of the discussions around the centenary.
And there was definitely, I saw a lot of tension between people who wanted to go and commemorate and the people who were kind of in reenactment mode, which was causing a lot of friction, I think, in Normandy.
It was interesting because the centenary, of course, was the point at which I think it was 2016. I really do need to go back and check this because I sort of threw that year out, when the last British serviceman died from the First World War. So the centenary years were the point at which that living memory of military service. We still have people who were alive during the First World War, but they were children, and that is a different perspective. A lot of the framing of D-Day was about, this is the last time we will see the veterans there. That's how old they are. I think that's a similarity, that some of the experiences of how do we deal with the movement from memory to history that the centenary has helped shape those conversations. And certainly, I know that academics and those of us who are involved in public engagement of academic research for both world wars. I've been in lots of meetings with people who work on the Second World War who then turn to me and say, so, lessons learned? And I'm going, I'm not sure.
Give us some more time. It's only been 10 years since it started.
What's the line? It's too soon to say.
You talk about the expansion of social and cultural history, and certainly when I think I was an undergraduate in the whenever it was the early 90s, cultural history felt like a bit of a new whiz-bangy sort of thing that people seem to be doing. I wondered how much of that social and cultural history, and if we sort of rub that along with gender studies, do you feel it is being picked up by popular media? Is it starting to cross over, or is it just a fringe subject that gets boiled down to sort of the women's experience, the Kate moments? Why are we not seeing more of it?
Well, I think it's that point where I'm going to be teaching a social and cultural history of modern war, which is how I've managed to fit the South African War and the two world wars into a single module title next year. And the first lecture is going to be, so what is cultural history? And it's actually a cultural history of war. And that's going to be looking back to when the journal Social and Economic History relaunched as Social and Cultural History, which is what it is now. It's the Journal of the Social History Society, but culture is there in the title. And there was a sort of several months worth of acrimonious debate in the pages between Peter Bendler and I cannot remember who he was debating with, because I never can, about the meaning of cultural history and why it needed to supplant economic history as an approach in relation to what is called the cultural turn. Now, that's very sort of academic theory methodology. That's something that academics spend a lot of time thinking about. We teach it to our undergraduates. I'm not sure it's terribly helpful for helping the general public understand the bits that interest them, for engaging their interest. What I do think is quite useful is that in some ways, cultural history approaches, thinking critically about cultural sources, for instance, has sort of entered the discourse, has entered the discussions without the need for sort of focusing on the methodology, the why we do it, which we might want to do in our research work, in journal articles or in the classroom. But when we're just going out and saying 1917 has interesting things to say about the history of the war and about the present day, people are very receptive to that. This podcast is proof, right? So I think without realizing that it is a rigorous critical approach to history, people are absorbing cultural history all the time. And what we can do as historians who want to communicate this is ensure that those discussions are as rigorous as we can without bogging everybody down in too much theory. When we say it's a bit more complicated, how do we communicate that without,
I was saying, because in some respects, I think cultural history is potentially more important now than it ever has been as we sort of lurch round politically. It kind of explains sometimes where we are and some of the misconceptions people have. And
of course, gender history as an aspect of cultural history, the meanings of words can be really confusing. You talk about the culture wars. Well, what does that mean? And cultural history actually is one way of unpacking that and understanding that and pointing out that, a lot of things which everybody says, oh, this is so new and so problematic. It's like, actually, no, this has been going on for a long time. And do you want some very funny photographs of the Men's Dress Liberation Society of men in skirts in the 1920s if we're going to talk about men in skirts?
So which we really should do a compilation discussion on cross-dressing in film and put together a full list of
something came up the other day on cross-dressing, which was essentially where someone made an assumption that because concert parties had men cross-dressing, that this was part of queer history. Where was it? It was something in relation. I know what it was. Sorry, this was a piece of student work using an archive, which was collected in the 1970s, with the intention of queering the archive, of being an archive of gay history, which had a whole series of postcards of concert parties that includes those, because men were cross-dressing, and that assumption circa 1970, that this meant that they were an aspect of gay history. And the student was a little bit uncritical of this. And actually, I was thinking, we really need to do something on cross-dressing as gender history. That this is back to that point I made about the ways in which queer history risks pushing out some of our understanding of gender as including the straight white man.
Yeah. Over 8.5 Hot One, clearly that documentary proves the student's point. I wondered if actually something else that occurred to me. You discussed gender norms and the liminality of combatant and non-combatant service, and your example is aid givers who are non-combatants but they're not soldiers. I wondered if any of your public engagement, anyone has ever fed back on that and how they feel about suddenly their realization that people are not necessarily soldiers, and they kind of surely he was at the Somme. Well, he was at the Somme, he's not.
Actually, what I tend to get is the other way on. And this is interesting because it tells you how important the figure of the conscientious objector has become in British understanding. That what I tend to get was, oh, he was a stretcher bearer, therefore he must have been a conscientious objector. And I'm going, no, he's actually a soldier. He's an enlisted soldier if he's in the RAMC. Now, if he's in the FAU, if he's in one of the male VAD units, because yes, there were about 500 male VAD units during the war. Yes, he would have been a civilian serving in a war zone. But the military really doesn't like civilians serving in the war zone. So most of the male caregivers, because they are in medical units, they're not allowed to carry arms. They are non-combatants. But so the Labour Corps, the British West Indies Regiment ends up in Labour battalions. They don't carry arms. They're still soldiers. They still wear uniform. They still come under military discipline. So for a lot of people, there's a sense that they can be a soldier, even if they're not killing, but they might have the intention of killing. That can be really disruptive for some people who go, oh, my great uncle was a stretcher bearer, therefore he must have been a conscientious objector. And I can live with that personally because it means my great uncle didn't want to go out and kill the enemy. It's a little bit more complicated. Yeah, I've had very few people who've pushed back on but he was on the Somme, therefore he must have been a soldier. It's very much been the inverse, interestingly.
That's like me telling people that their relatives probably was conscripted rather than volunteered. They're adamant that he volunteered. No, it's been late in the war for volunteering.
Yeah, they weren't looking for a show of hands by 1917.
They might have been willing to go, but that's not the same thing.
It's curious what people like to be challenged on or not challenged on. You also made a really interesting point, which I was aware of, but I hadn't really had verbalized or thought through. Literary sources are a valid view of the First World War. I just wondered, for the people who haven't heard your the lecture, which will at some point be available we'll put a link out. It will be.
It's going to be available on the University of Leeds. The Leeds Arts and Humanities Research Institute website will be hosting it eventually.
But I wonder if you could expand upon literary sources as a valid view of the First World War.
So when I was starting out, the go-to book for the history of the First World War was Paul Fussell's The Great War in Modern Memory. I read it my first year as an undergraduate and thought, that's the book I want to write when I write history. And then returned to it many, many, many times over the course of my academic career, increasingly problematizing it. It is a really problematic book in a lot of ways. But there is a very, very long tradition of taking texts written about the war, some of which are fictional, some of which are semi-fictional, some of which the fictionality is highly debated. And here I'm thinking about Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, which was attacked from the moment of publication for making things up, as source material. Just as, propaganda posters are taken as source material. And of course, then the other thing we have in Britain is a very long tradition of novels about the war. And when we think about those waves of representation, we've got the 1929 war books boom, which is kicked off by All Quiet on the Western Front in Britain. There are a lot of novels about the war. And Rosa Maria Bracco's written a really good book, which gives you a sense of just how many popular, what she calls middlebrow novels, were being written about the war and about ex-servicemen coming back from the war. And then you get, there's quite a lull in the middle of the 20th century, but then in the 1980s, and this, I think Pat Barker is probably, again, kicks it off with Regeneration, this fictionalized, the historical fictions. Historical fiction covers a huge range of quality of work. Pat Barker's books are wonderful. I really enjoy reading them. But you have the Regeneration trilogy, you have Birdsong, you have fiction writers recreating or writing histories. And that's a history in and of itself, that development of ideas, of understandings about the war as they are then fictionalized. What becomes important? Suddenly you have Sebastian Faulks focusing on the sappers, who get very little representation in 1930s fictional. It's almost all infantry, and usually officers, and usually middle-class officers. So then you've got Pat Barker doing working class representations of shell shock. Still problematic why she couldn't give voice to an infantryman. But what's interesting about those is they speak to the moment at which they're written, so the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, as well as to the 1910s, the war years that and after that they're representing. So there's all sorts of different layers, and there's different forms that this takes. So my way in was thinking about, well, where does the war just turn up in genre fiction, in detective fiction, which isn't about the war and isn't sold as being about the war? And this has been acknowledged. Alison Light writes about this. The war is there. And one of the theories about Golden Age detective fiction is that, and I think we've talked about this previously, is that it's a reparative form of literature, that readers read it to get a sense of security that however disastrous things are, murder has taken place, it will be resolved and justice will be done and be seen to be done. That's sort of the message of Golden Age detective fiction as opposed to noir or thrillers, which is complicated because there are plenty of Golden Age detective writers who do that more ambiguous noirish sort of thing. These are books that aren't war books, but where the war is an essential part of it. So they're source material in that sense. We can understand how the war was being absorbed into British culture. And I focus on Britain. This is true in other cultures and internationally, because you've got things like All Quiet on the Western Front hugely influencing cultures beyond Germany. But then also, how do these things change over time? What does it tell us across the 20th century? And I suppose this is sort of taking us into the section of my lecture, which is about where I'm going with all of this, which is, I talked a lot about the new book, which has taken me a long time to work out what it's going to be about, but it's about thinking about a lot of the academic studies of the aftermath of war are about memory, are about the dead, and about memorials. And I'm interested in the men who come back, because there were over 4 million of them in the British case. They didn't all necessarily come back to the British Isles. A lot of them go out into the British Empire, which at the time has its largest landmass in its history. And that return to civilian life for many of them, not all of them. I'm going to have a chapter on returning to war, which is going to think about the men who stay in the military or in some form of military service. That shapes the 20th century. And I think, if you look at the 1960s and the rhetoric around the 50th anniversary of the war, that was really well understood. Yes, they had just had a Second World War, but even that was felt to have had its roots in the First World War. And I think that is a shift that the death of the last serviceman, this move from memory to history, has really, that was a tipping point in the centenary, that the extent to which the war wasn't just confined to the 4.5 years of conflict, or even in the Irish case to the decade, they had a decade of centenaries. There are all these ripples outwards from the war. And the bit that we don't look at are the men who came back. We look at a lot of these ripples. We look at the loss, the dead, the absence. We look at we've looked at changes in women's opportunities for employment, economic changes, and the shift in economic power between Europe and the US, shifts in political power. But we haven't really looked at just the ordinary men who came back since the last of them died. And that's what this next book is about.
Well, that's sort of, have you got anything else, Chris? That sort of seems like a good place to...
No, I was just going to say, if you could have, send me over a copy of that book by the end of the week, there's no rush.
Yeah, so that's the challenge, of course. I have actually written 2/3 of one chapter. It's which I'm going, this is far too long. It's only supposed to be 7,500 words, and 2/3 of a chapter is already edging up to 8,000 words, and I've still got to talk about teaching. It is getting there. I don't even have a publisher for it yet. I'm hoping to get a book proposal to a publisher with this sample chapter in some sort of form by the end of the summer. But I'm also writing 11 lectures on cultural history of modern conflict in Britain this summer. There's a lot going on. There always is. I should say I've also been approached by Polity Press to write a global history of masculinity and warfare. So I'm trying to do that as well. And that's going to be a much more synthetic work that's taking other people's research and saying, yes, and if we look at what's happening in Latin America and what's happening in Europe in the 1960s, we can see this about how militaries were understood as gendered spaces.
Sounds great. I'll have that one at the end of the week as well, please.
I think you're partly to blame, Chris, because I think Polity approached me on the back of our joint article for the Encyclopedia on subjectivity and or experiences of war. So you'll get blamed in the acknowledgements.
I'll happily take blame for shiny publications coming out.
I know this has been about my inaugural, but when I came into the meeting, Angus, you were chatting a little bit about post-PhD life, because I know you're at a bit of a turning point as well. Did you just want to say a word about what you're doing and where you're going now that I've done mine?
I'm not sure how I managed to write my PhD. I now sit down every morning wondering where the time was that I had to sit down 5 mornings a week to type. I somehow seem to be busier than ever. Academically, I have 2 projects I would like to undertake. One is to look at conscription from the First World War through to the Second World War and take my research in that way, specifically looking at men who don't want to go to war in the Second World War, because I hadn't realised there's 800,000 men during the Second World War who say they don't want to go due to hardship. Well, that's a lot of men. There's 800,000. No, there's not. There's 80,000 conscientious objectors. We're edging up to 1 million men there who don't want to fight in the Second World War, and their story's certainly been lost, as has those in the First World War. So I'm quite interested in joining all that up to with my PhD to produce a book. During my PhD, I bumped into some small archive of tribunal papers for men appealing in one area of the North Yorkshire Dales. So I was intrigued at looking at it for the simple reason that I then would have the local records and the county records. And I certainly think there's something there to join up to say what's the locality doing and how does that refer on a county level. So that's academically, that's what I'm aspiring to do, but I somehow don't seem to have the time because I seem to have just so much podcast stuff going on with various bits and pieces. And I'm meant to be speaking at the Imperial War Museum in October, is the theory, with the World War II podcast. That's where I am. I am trying to shovel work out of the way to do more work, which sounds ridiculous.
Sounds very familiar. And Chris, you have a book out, I think.
So by the time this podcast this is our July episode, is it not?
Yes.
Not to date. When we're recording it. So yeah, when this is released, we'll be a few days away from my new Star Wars book, licensed Star Wars book coming out. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. It's an in-universe history book, which I think hopefully fans of geeky things will get a kick out of. I kind of firmly believe that there's a lot in there for historians. There's stuff that I think we can use for it, but it's effectively impossible for me to talk about any of those things until it's come out and anybody's actually read it.
I'm going to have to expand my Men in War, a global history, to being Men in War, a pan-galactic history, aren't I?
You absolutely, I think you should, firstly, not in the sense that I get any financial benefit from it.
I'm not sure how I deal with all the non-human genders.
It's partially covered in the introduction in regards to different species and the like. Yeah, the introduction of the book for historians is basically like a crash course in how to write a history essay or a historical book for an audience who hopefully at some point in the future may consider doing much the same themselves, which should be fun. And that coming out is, a mix of extreme excitement and extreme anxiety, depending on any given day.
So for our audience, we are all at interesting turning points, all overworked to a greater or lesser extent. Do we know what we're doing next time?
Me and Angus were talking before we started recording. So we've got various options. We've got, at some point, we want to get Mark Connolly to come along and talk about his guiding new job. If we want to talk about teaching the war, we could get Katrina and Anne-Marie Einhaus along. There's the First World War science fiction fantasy novel that came up in our email conversations.
The Warm Hands of Ghosts.
Yes, which I think would be a good fun one. Ian Isherwood has just announced he's got a new book coming out shortly. I think he'd be a great guest because I'm stunned that we've never had him on, and we really should have done.
No, and his new book looks great because it's the study of a single battalion, isn't it?
And Annie Foster has got a book coming out as well, who I think... So basically, we could almost fill the year up at this point.
And we're also looking at some of the demobilisation of troops into the 20s, were we? We discussed that at some point.
Yeah, that was going to be a Jessica episode.
It was. I didn't know if that was going to be this episode, but it wasn't. And this was men instead, or gender, or something.
And even a bit further down the line, once my book is out and about in the world, if we want to do something about writing fictional histories, which could be fun. That means you both may have to read a Star Wars book, which I'm kind of apologetic, but not in a sense I mean it.
Well, do you want to give us me and the audience a reading assignment for next time, I suppose.
Well, perhaps we should try the Warm Hands of Ghosts.
Sounds like good summer reading.
Yeah, by Catherine Arden as our reading project for listeners. Well, if that's all from us for now, thank you and congratulations again, Jessica.
Thank you, and thank you for indulging me with both listening to the original inaugural and asking me all sorts of really interesting questions about it. It's been fun.
Well, we'd waited for the inaugural for several years because the universe got in the way.
Yes, I know. Yes. Minor matter, small matter of a pandemic.
Very good. Right. Well, until next time.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we won't be thinking when we got love and